Chapter 6 of the Pianoforte Sonata by John South Shedlock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Predecessors of Beethoven 1. Muzio Clementi. Muzio Clementi, born at Rome in 1752, was brought to England by Alderman Beckford, father of the author of Walfrecht, and at Fonthill Abbey he had leisure to study the works of Handel, John Sebastian Bach, Emanuel Bach, Domenico Scarlatti and Paradis. Clementi, like Scarlatti, was a virtuoso. But although both indulged largely in technical display, they were true and intelligent artists. In Scarlatti, the balance between his musical ideas and the form in which they were presented was almost perfect. In Clementi, virtuosity often gained the ascendancy over virtue. With the latter, however, as indeed with Bach, Haydn, Mozart and many other composers, the necessity of earning a living, and therefore of writing for long ears, mixed with the love of fame, produced works which, like the old Eden tree, contained both good and evil. To judge such great men really fairly, the chaff ought to be separated from the wheat, and the chaff ought to be thoroughly removed, even at the risk of sometimes losing a portion of wheat. To the true lover of music, choice selections are more precious than complete collections. The latter are, of course, necessary to those whose business it is to study the rise and development of the various composers. The pianoforte sonatas of Mozart, Haydn, Dussek and Clementi might be reduced to very moderate compass. To suggest that any one of Beethoven's 32 should be removed out of its place would now sound flat blasphemy, but art progresses, and some even now are falling into oblivion. The catalogue of music performed at the popular concerts during the history of the past 35 years shows pretty clearly which sonatas of Beethoven are likely to live long and which not. But to return to Clementi. He published his first three sonatas, Opus 2, numbers 1 to 3, in 1770, the year in which Beethoven was born, and the influence which he exerted over that master was considerable. In Beethoven's library were to be found many sonatas of Clementi, and the master's predilection for them is well known. The world seldom renders full justice to men who prepared the way for greater than themselves. Pachelbel, Böhm and Buxtehude, the immediate predecessors of Bach, and again Emanuel Bach, to whom Haydn was so indebted, and whose works were undoubtedly studied by Beethoven, are notable examples. This is, of course, perfectly natural. The best only survives. But musicians who take serious interest in their art ought, from time to time, to look back and see how much was accomplished and suggested by men who, in comparison with their mighty contemporaries and successors, are legitimately ranked as second rate. Among such, Clementi holds high place. Beethoven overshadowed the Italian composer, but the harsh judgment expressed by Mozart. Clementi is a charlatan, like all the Italians. Letter to his sister, June 7, 1783. Has contributed not a little, we imagine, to the indifference now shown to the Clementi sonatas. It is 35 years since the fine one in B minor was performed at the popular concerts, and 18 since a Clementi sonata has appeared on a popular concert programme. The judgment was a severe one, but Otto Jahn relates how Clementi told his pupil Berger that, at the period of which Mozart writes, he devoted his attention to brilliant execution, and in particular to double runs and extemporized passages. And again, Berger himself was of opinion that the sonatas selected for performance by Clementi at the memorable concert with Mozart in presence of the Emperor Joseph II, December 1781, was decidedly inferior to his earlier compositions of the same kind. The sonata in question was the one in B flat, B and H, No. 61, Holler, No. 37, of which the opening theme commences in the same manner as the allegro of the overture to the Magic Flute. Mozart suffered from the predominant Italian influence at court, and the "like all the Italians" in the letter just mentioned shows, to say the least, a bitter spirit. But the letter was a private one, hastily written. The judgment expressed was formed from an inferior work. In any case, it must not be taken too seriously. Mozart, by the way, was not the only composer who failed to render justice to his contemporaries. Clementi's sonatas may be roughly divided into three classes. Some he wrote merely for the display of technique, while some were composed for educational purposes. But there remain others in which his heart and soul were engaged, and in these he reaches a very high level. Our classification is a rough one, for often in those which we consider his best, there is plenty of showy technique. With the exception of Mozart's Sonata in C minor and Haydn's Genzinger and London sonatas, both in E flat, also some of Rust's, of which we shall soon have something to say, there are, to our thinking, none which in spirit come nearer to Beethoven than some of Clementi's. Mr. E. Dannreuther, in his article on the composer in Sir George Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians, justly remarks that a judicious selection from his entire works would prove a boon. In order to trace the relationship between Clementi and Beethoven, it may be well to state that Clementi in 1783 had published up to opus 11, Sonata and Toccata. The Toccata, by the way, is not included in the Breitkopf and Hartel edition. It appeared first, we believe, together with the sonata, in a London edition. Beethoven's first sonatas, opus 2, appeared only in 1796. Footnote: the three sonatas in E flat, F minor and D, dedicated to Maximilian Frederick, Elector of Cologne, and published at Speyer in 1783, are not here taken into account. End of footnote. By 1802, Clementi had published up to opus 40, in which year Beethoven composed two of the three sonatas, opus 31, numbers 1 to 3. Between 1820 and 21 appeared Clementi's sonata opus 46, dedicated to Kalkbrenner, and the last set of three sonatas including the Didone Abbandonata, opus 50. Beethoven's sonata in E, opus 109, appeared in November 1821. Thus Clementi at first influenced Beethoven, but later on the reverse must have been the case. Breitkopf and Hartel have published 64 sonatas of Clementi, and of these 63 are to be found in the Holler edition. Footnote: in mentioning any of them we shall first give the Breitkopf and Hartel numbers and then the Holler numbers in brackets, so that either edition may be referred to. End of footnote. The three sonatas, opus 2, numbers 1, 2, 3, 25, 26, 27, have only two movements, and they are principally remarkable for their showy technique. Footnote: at the time of their production Dussek was not born, Hummel was still a child, and Beethoven an infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. If indeed the Beethovens were able to afford the luxury of a nurse. Even Emanuel Bach had not published any of his Leipzig collections, neither had Haydn written his best sonatas. As Clementi was not only the survivor of Beethoven, but also his predecessor, a reminder as to the state of the sonata world when Clementi first entered it is not wholly unnecessary. End of footnote. Clementi, of course, was well acquainted with Scarlatti's music, yet it would perhaps be difficult to point out any direct influence of the one over the other. In the next three sonatas, opus 9, numbers 4, 5, 6, 11, 28, 12, the first and third are most interesting. In the second, Clementi indulges in his favourite passages of thirds, sixths and octaves. There is, indeed, a presto movement, a moto perpetuo for the right hand, in octaves, which, if taken up to time, would tax even pianists of the present day. The first sonata may be noticed for its bold chords, and its sforzandos on unaccented beats, which sounds Beethovenish. The third sonata reminds us in many ways of the Bonn Master. In the opening allegro there is a sighing figure, which plays an important part throughout the movement, and therefore gives a marked character to it. In the development sections, the bold contrasts, the powerful chords, the sign figure in augmentation all point to Beethoven, and curiously enough, the principal theme, which now appears in major, the sonata is in G minor, reminds one very strongly of the Eroica. It is worth noticing that the sighing figure may be traced in the other two movements of the sonata. The next sonata, number 10, 44, has three movements, all in the same key. The trio of the minuet is in the key of the subdominant. In the first movement may be noticed an extension of a phrase by repetition, pianissimo, of its last two notes, a feature often to be met with in Beethoven. See for instance the first movement of the Appassionata development section. The piano phrase in the rondo of number 11, 45, before the organ point and the pause bar is striking. Number 14, 2, is interesting. The broken octaves at the end of the exposition section and the return by ellipsis to the principal theme call to mind passages in Beethoven's Opus 22 and Opus 109. Sonata number 16, 4, has a delightful first movement, and the evolution of the second subject from the first deserves attention. In number 18, 51, there is one point to notice. The key of the first movement is in F, but the principal theme in the recapitulation section appears in E flat. The second theme, however, according to rule, in the tonic. Sonata number 19, 52, in F minor, demands more than a passing word. Our readers will, perhaps, be tired of our noticed foreshadowings of Beethoven, yet we must add others here. We can assure them, however, or rather those who are not familiar with Clementi's sonatas, that the passages to which we call attention only form a small proportion of those to which we might refer. The first movement, Allegro agitato, is concise, there is no padding. Every bar of the exposition section may be termed thematic. The second subject, in the orthodox relative major, is evolved from the principal theme, and the latter descends but the former ascends, a true Beethoven contrast. The coda to the first section, with its working of a thematic figure in augmentation, forms a striking feature. At the close of the development section, a long dignified dominant passage seems a preparation for the return of the principal theme, but the composer has a surprise. After a pause bar, the second theme appears, and in A flat. A modulation soon leads back to F minor, and quite in Beethoven fashion. And the exposition coda is repeated in extended form. In the next movement, Largo e sostenuto, sombre tones still prevail. The key is that of the dominant minor. There is evident kinship between the first and last movements. Of this the opening bar of the former and the closing bars of the latter offer signal proof. In number 23, 43, at the end of the last movement, an organ point reminds us that the full intentions of the composer are not recorded. Thus, in Clementi's early sonatas at any rate, the interpreter, as in E. Bach's work, was expected to make additions. In number 26, 7, the opening of the theme of the Arietta recalls, and in no vague manner, the opening of the finale of Beethoven's septet. Number 34, 8, is an excellent sonata. There is considerable freedom in the recapitulation section. In number 39, 35, Clementi returns to an old form of sonata. There are only two movements, a larghetto and tempo di menuetto, and both in the same key. With sonata number 41, 32, the first of two published as Opus 34, Clementi breaks new ground. The idea of incorporating the subject matter of an introductory slow movement had already occurred to Haydn. Footnote: London Symphony in E flat, number 8, number 1 in the Breitkopf and Hartel catalogue. End of footnote. But Clementi goes to greater lengths. It must not be forgotten that Beethoven's Sonate Pathétique, opus 13, appeared in 1799, possibly before Clementi's. From the opening characteristic subject of the Largo is evolved the principal subject of the Allegro con fuoco, and there is also relationship between it and the second subject. In the unusually long development section, a dramatic passage, evolved from the concluding bars of the Largo, leads to a slow section in which the opening tones of the Largo are given out in loud tones and in the unexpected key of C major. The three repeated sforzando crotchets remind one of the Fate notes in the C minor symphony, and when the tempo primo is resumed, the also reminds one of in the same movement of the above mentioned symphony. Then again, in an important coda the theme is given out in modified yet intensified form. In the finale of the sonata the Largo still makes its influence felt. Exception may perhaps be taken to the length of the first movement, and to the prominence throughout the work of the principal key, but the evident desire of the composer to express something which was inwardly moving him gives great interest to the music. The sonata in B minor, opus 40, is one of Clementi's most finished productions. The name of Beethoven must again be mentioned. For depth of meaning, boldness, style of development and gradation of interest, the music comes within measurable distance of the greater master. Not only is there no padding, but here the technique serves a higher purpose than that of display. There are no formal successions of thirds, sixths or octaves, no empty bravura passages. The long development section of the first movement, with its bold contrasts, its varied presentation of thematic material, its peculiar mode of dealing with fragments of a theme, and its long dwelling on dominant harmony previous to the return of the principal theme, all these things remind one of Beethoven. The movement is followed by a Largo, mesto e patetico, leading to the final Allegro. These two are intimately connected, and moreover, the latter includes reminiscences from the introductory Adagio. After a brief reference to the Largo, the movement concludes with a passionate presto coda. In Mr. Bannister's Life of Macfarren, we learn that the latter considered the B minor of Clementi one of the finest sonatas ever written, and many musicians will, probably, agree with him. Of the three last sonatas, opus 50, numbers 1, 2 and 3, it must be remembered that when they appeared, Beethoven had published up to opus 106 and possibly opus 109. If, then, in some of the earlier Clementi sonatas we spoke of his influence on Beethoven, it is just the reverse here. Nevertheless, of these sonatas which must have been known to that master, one may have led him to think again about the idea of revealing the poetic basis of his sonatas. Clementi gives the title Di Done Abbandonata Scena Tragica to his work. The introductory Largo is sostenuto and patetico, while the Allegro which follows bears the superscription Deliberando e meditando. The Adagio is dolente, and the Allegro finale agitato e con disperazione. The music expresses throughout the sorrow and despair of the forsaken queen, while certain wild passages, as for example the coda of the first Allegro, tell also of her anger. This Allegro is an admirably sustained movement, and, at moments, the composer rises to the height of his argument. It is interesting, too, from a technical point of view, for there is no empty display. Whatever degree of inspiration may be accorded to the music, it will surely be acknowledged that the composer was full of his theme, that all his powers of head and heart were engaged in the task of illustration. This Dido sonata, of course, suffers if compared to those of Clementi's great contemporary, and some of the writing is formal and old fashioned, and at times too thin to attract the sympathy or to excite the interest of pianists of the present day, who enjoy the richer inheritance of Beethoven, the romantic tone pictures of Schumann and Brahms, the fascinating miniatures of Chopin, and the clever glitter of Liszt. Still it does not deserve utter oblivion. Hear what Frau Rollitz said of it in Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. It, the sonata, is indeed a tragic scene, one so clearly thought out and so definitely expressed that it is by no means difficult, not only in each movement, but in its various divisions, to follow literally the course of changing feeling which is here developed. Schindler, with regard to the work, also remarks as follows: "Who understands nowadays how to interpret this musical soul picture, written unfortunately in old stereotyped sonata form? At best, glancing hastily over it, a pianist carelessly remarks that the poetic contents of this sonata are only expressed in the title." And again, "In the year 1827, at Baden, near Vienna, Clementi gave me details respecting the contents and interpretation of this tone poem. A new edition of the work by J. André of Offenbach enabled me to insert a preface with the explanations of the veteran master." Footnote: Schindler, Biography of Beethoven, 3rd edition, volume 2, pages 223 to 4. End of footnote. And further, as a tone picture expressing states of the soul, he knows "of no other work entitled sonata more worthy of a place besides those of Beethoven." 2. Johann Ludwig Dussek. This composer comes next to Clementi in order of time, and we may add of merit. His natural gifts really exceed those of Clementi, but the latter made a deep study of his art and also of the pianoforte, to which, indeed, like Chopin, he devoted his whole attention. Dussek was fond of ease and pleasure and never developed his powers to the full. It may be noted that both these celebrated pianists were connected with English music publishing houses. Clementi prospered, though not in his first undertaking with Longman and Broderep. But Dussek was unsuccessful and left England, so it is said, to avoid his creditors. There is, indeed, a letter written by Dussek from Hamburg, dated 12th June 1801, to Clementi, and apart from the curious spectacle of these two pianists in commercial correspondence with each other, the letter is of interest, in that it belongs to a period of Dussek's life concerning the details of which there is some uncertainty. Dussek, it may be mentioned, does not ever appear to have returned to London. In 1803 he became attached to Prince Louis Ferdinand, to whom he offered advice in pianoforte playing and composition. There is another letter extant of Dussek's written in the same year in which that prince fell on the battlefield of Saalfeld, 13th of October 1806, and this also we will give, as we believe, like the one above, it has never been published. The catalogue of Dussek's works, in Sir G. Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians, mentions 3 quartets for strings, opus 60 in G, B flat and E flat. Most probably the works referred to in the second letter. Dussek, born in the year 1761, studied first with his father J. J. Dussek, and in his 22nd year received further instruction from Emanuel Bach. He soon enjoyed great fame as an executant. Tomaszek, himself a pianist of note, thus speaks of him in his autobiography: "There was, in fact, something magical about the way in which Dussek, with all his charming grace of manner, through his wonderful touch, extorted from the instrument delicious and at the same time emphatic tones. His fingers were like a company of 10 singers, endowed with equal executive powers, and able to produce with the utmost perfection whatever the director could require. I never saw the Prague public so enchanted as they were on this occasion by Dussek's splendid playing. His fine declamatory style, especially in cantabile phrases, stands as the ideal for every artistic performance, something which no other pianist has since reached." The above quotation refers to a concert given at Prague in 1804. There is unfortunately great confusion in the opus numbers of Dussek's work, and moreover it is difficult, if not impossible, to give the dates either of composition or publication. Breitkopf and Hartel have published more than 50 sonatas, but we shall only refer to some of the more important ones. Dussek, like all the prominent composers of his time, not even excepting Haydn and Mozart, wrote music on a practical rather than on a poetic basis. One of the letters given above acknowledges this in very frank terms. But to Dussek's credit be it said, his least valuable works are masterpieces as compared with those which the sonata makers, Steibelt, Kramer and others, fabricated by the hundred. In Dussek we find great charm and refinement, while the writing for the instrument is often highly attractive, but the art of developing themes was certainly not his strong point. That he was at times careless or indifferent may be seen from such a bar as the following: Opus 47, No. 1, Litolf edition, Adagio, bar 9. The bar before the return to the principal theme in the Allegro of the sonata in E flat, opus 75, furnishes another instance. Again, in the Allegro of the sonata in A flat, known as Le Retour à Paris, there is a passage, commencing 15 bars before the end of the exposition section, which, with slight alteration, might have been materially improved. Of the early sonatas, Opus 10, No. 2, in G minor, is an interesting work. It consists of two well contrasted movements, an adagio in binary and a vivace in sonata form. Of the presto of Opus 10, No. 3, Professor Prout, in his interesting article Dussek's Pianoforte Sonatas (Musical Times, September and October 1877), says: "Both the first and second principal subjects remind us irresistibly of that composer, Mendelssohn, while the phrase at the conclusion of the first part, repeated at the end of the movement, is almost identical with a well-known passage in the first movement of the Scotch Symphony. Is the coincidence accidental, or did Mendelssohn know the sonata, and was he unconsciously influenced by it?" In his three last sonatas, opus 70, 75 and 77, Dussek rises to a very high level. He was undoubtedly influenced by the earnestness of Beethoven, the chivalric spirit of Weber and the poetry of Schubert. A new era had set in. These three composers were neither the fools of princes nor the servants of the public. They were in the world, yet not of it. They looked upon their art as a sacred thing, and most probably the shallowness of much of the music produced in such abundance towards the close of the 18th century spurred them on to higher efforts. Dussek had lived in an irregular, aimless sort of life. He had wandered from one country to another and had acquired the ephemeral fame of the virtuoso. Perhaps he was a disappointed man. There is a tinge of sadness about these last sonatas which supports such a view. Perhaps a feeling that his life was ebbing away made him serious. His music now shows no trifling. Explain it as you may, Dussek's three last contributions to sonata literature rank among the best of his day, and the indifference now shown to them, so far at least as the concert platform is concerned, is proof of ignorance or bad taste. We say ignorance because the rising generation has few, if any, opportunities of hearing this composer's music. It is 18 years since his opus 70 was given at the popular concerts, while 23 and 29 years have passed since opus 75 and opus 77 have been played there. The sonata in A flat, entitled Le Retour à Paris, is known in England as plus ultra, and in an old edition was dedicated to non plus ultra. The latter was meant for Wölfl, a famous pianist and contemporary. His music is now forgotten and his name is principally remembered in connection with Beethoven. Like the latter, his talent for improvisation was great. The late J. W. Davidson, in his long and interesting preface to Brewer and Company's edition of Dussek's A-flat Sonata, leads us to believe that Dussek's publisher, and not the composer himself, was responsible for the change of title to plus ultra. The opus number 2 was changed from 70 to 71. The following story is also told by Davidson in a preface contributed by him to the Brewer edition of the Wölfl Sonata. "Who will play it?" asked the publisher. "Well," looking through the music of the composer, "I will it play," replied Wölfl. "Yes, but you won't buy the copies. No one but yourself or Dussek can play the allegro, and I doubt if either of you can play the variations." Wölfl, however, sitting down before an old harpsichord, convinced the publisher of his error. "What shall we call it?" said Well. "Call it ne plus ultra," said Wölfl, rubbing his hands with joy, and adding, "Now shall we see if von Elsch will more play, or bombendo make de variation." Dussek's Plus Ultra, opus 70, is justly admired, the music is fine, and in the matter of technique, setting aside a few sensational passages, here is one in the 8th variation. In Wölfl's sonata, which his very long fingers enabled him to execute with comparative ease, far surpassed the earlier work. It must appear strange to many musicians who do not possess a copy of Wölfl's sonata that, in any mention of the rivalry between the two composers, no reference is made to Wölfl's sonata beyond the title. An examination of the latter, however, would soon solve the mystery. The plain fact is this: both the music and the technique are now absolutely uninteresting. The sonata in the key of F major commences with a brief introductory adagio followed by a long, tedious allegro abounding in passages of thirds. A brief andante comes between this allegro and the finale, consisting of flimsy variations of the popular melody "Life Let Us Cherish." In a book of small compass such as the present one, we only wish to dwell upon matters of interest. For some particular purpose Wölfl's sonatas might possibly prove of importance and even interest, but not here. The non plus ultra, so far as we are concerned, may serve to remind us that Wölfl once lived, while the rest of his music, like some incidents in his life, may be consigned to oblivion. We cannot say that we have read all his sonatas, but enough of them, we believe, to judge, generally, of their contents. Professor Macfarren's opinion of Dussek, as composer of the pianoforte, in the Imperial Dictionary of Biography is so excellent that we cannot perhaps do better than quote his words. The immense amount of Dussek's compositions for the pianoforte have by no means equal merit. Many of them were written for the mere object of sale, still more for the purpose of tuition, and some with the design of executive display. Of those which were produced, however, in the true spirit of art, expressing the composer's feelings in his own unrestrained ideas, there exist quite enough to stamp him one of the first composers for his instrument, and while these are indispensable in the complete library of the pianist, they are above value to the student in the development of his mechanism and the formation of his style. A strong characteristic of the composer is his almost redundant profusion of ideas. Mendelssohn too complained that Dussek was a prodigal. But his rich fecundity of invention is greatly counterbalanced by diffuseness of design, resulting from the want of that power of condensation by means of which greater interest is often given to less beautiful matter. And then, again, in an analysis of a Dussek quintet, he remarks that in that composer's works we may trace not only the origin of many of the most beautiful effects with which later writers have been accredited, but some of the identical ideas by which these very writers have made their way into popularity. 3. Friedrich Wilhelm Rust. During the years 1744 to 45, a young man named Johann Ludwig Anton Rust went to Leipzig to study jurisprudence and philosophy. But he was also musical, and playing the violin at performances given under the direction of J.S. Bach. On returning to his home at Wörlitz, Rust tried to inspire those around him with enthusiasm for the music of Bach. With his younger brother Friedrich Wilhelm he was, at any rate, successful, for the latter, already at the age of 13, was able to play by heart the whole of the Well Tempered Clavier. Later on young Friedrich went to Halle to study law, and there not only made the acquaintance of Friedemann Bach, but, in return for attending to the correspondence of that gifted musician, he received from him instruction in composition, organ and clavier playing. Afterwards, at Potsdam, he continued his clavier studies under Emanuel Bach. Surely a finer training never fell to the lot of any pupil. Schumann recommends young musicians to make Bach their daily bread, and of that, Rust must have had full weight. But the list of his teachers is not yet exhausted. He went to Italy in 1765 and studied the violin under Tartini. Rust composed operas, cantatas, concertos and sonatas for violin. Footnote: the one in D minor has often been performed at the popular concerts. And for pianoforte, the last named, of which he wrote 8, now concern us. The earliest, entitled Sonata Erotica, was composed in 1775. This work, however, was not published until the year 1888, edited by his grandson, Dr. Wilhelm Rust (1822 1892), late cantor of St. Thomas's. It is the first of a series of works extraordinary in many ways, in form, subject matter, developments and technique. With regard to the last named there is something to say, and it had better be said at once. Dr. E. Praeger, in his interesting pamphlet F. W. Rust, Einvorgänge Beethovens, remarks as follows: while the grandson, full of enthusiasm, threw his whole soul at the creations of his ancestor, he gave a reflection, in his edition, of the pictures which had been vividly formed in his mind. To accomplish this he has strengthened the writing, and in some cases modernized it. Dr. Praeger, who has seen some, if not all, of the autographs, has assured us that these editions only concern the exterior and do not affect the fundamental character of the work. This statement is, to a certain extent, satisfactory, and we receive it thankfully. But a great deal of the writing is far ahead of the age in which it was written. It reminds one now of Weber, now of Schumann. Why, one may ask, did not the editor indicate the additions in smaller notes? Then it would have been possible to see exactly what the elder Rust had written and what the younger Rust had added. At present one can only marvel at some of the writing, and long to know how much of it really belongs to the composer. It appears that Rust, as editor of his grandfather's work, had some intention of describing his additions, etc., but death, which frequently prevents the best intentioned plans, intervened. The Sonata Erotica is noticeable, generally, for its charm, poetry and spontaneity. The first movement, an allegro moderato, is in sonata form. The second, in the key of the relative minor, entitled Fantasy, has in it more of the spirit of Beethoven than of Emanuel Bach. The finale is in rondo form, the middle section consists of a playful duettino containing 3 imitations. The next sonata, 1777, in D flat, opens with a graceful allegretto, and closes with a tempo diminuetto, which for the most part points backwards rather than forwards. The slow movement, adagio sostenuto, is, however, of a higher order than either of these. It has Beethovenish breadth and dignity, yet lacks the power of the Bonn master, those magic touches by which the latter makes us feel his genius, and secures gradation of interest up to the very close of a movement. This adagio, however, were the date of its composition unknown, might pass for a very clever imitation of Beethoven's style. In 1784 Rust wrote 2 sonatas, one in F sharp minor, the other in B flat minor. The latter consists of 3 movements, and the music, especially in the adagio in E flat minor, bears traces of the great Bach. Still there are passages which sound more modern even in this very adagio, which points so clearly to him as the source of inspiration. The modern element, however, admits of explanation. For Haydn and Mozart, at the time in which the sonata was written, had appeared in the musical firmament. But in the works we are about to mention the composer suggests Beethoven, Weber and even Schumann. In writing about Clementi, we were compelled frequently, and at the risk of wearying our readers, to call attention to foreshadowings of both the letter and spirit of Beethoven. The cases of Clementi and Rust, however, are not quite parallel. With the former it was mere foreshadowing, the exception of a few passages in which there was note resemblance between the two composers. The music still bore traces of Clementi's mode of thought and style of writing. But with Rust there are moments in which it is really difficult to believe that the music belongs to a pre-Beethoven period. The sonata the original title is Sonata per il cembalo o fortepiano di F. W. Rust, 1788. In D minor, 1788, opens with a vigorous yet dignified allegro. The graceful adagio is of 18th century type. It is in the key of the relative major, but closes on the dominant chord of D minor, leading without break to a final allegro full of interesting details. The movement concludes with an impressive poco adagio coda, in which Rust makes use of the principal theme of the opening movement. We will venture on one quotation, although a few bars, separated from the context, may convey only a feeble impression. The sonata in D major, composed 6 years later, opens with an interesting allegro. The second movement in B minor bears the superscription Wehklager, lamentation. Rust's eldest son, a talented youth, who was studying at Halle University, was drowned in the river Saale, 23rd of March 1794. Mattheson, the Adelaide poet, sent to the disconsolate father a poem entitled Totenkranz für ein Kind, to which Rust sketched music, and on that sketch is based this pathetic movement, which sounds like some tone poem of the 19th century. Here is the impressive coda. There follows a dainty, old-fashioned minuet and a curious movement entitled Schwermut und Frohsinn, melancholy and mirth. It is curious to note that in the supplement of the Breitkopf and Hartel edition of Beethoven's works there are two little pieces entitled Lustig und Traurig. Though after the Wehklager these make little impression. During 4 years, 1792 to 96, Rust was occupied with a sonata in C minor and major. The work is a remarkable one. It opens with an energetic recitativo in C minor, interrupted by a few bars of an arioso adagio in C major. Then comes a lento in 6/4 time, based on the celebrated Malbrook song, a dignified movement containing, among other canonic imitations, one in the 9th. It leads by means of a stringendo bar to a brilliant allegro con brio, a movement of which both the music and the technique remind one of Beethoven's bravura style. A second section of the sonata commences with the recitative phrase of the opening of the work, only in A minor. This leads to a highly characteristic andante, which Dr. Rust, the editor, in a preface to the published sonata, likens to the mighty procession in Lenau's Faust. The finale consists of an animated allegro with a clever fugato by way of episode. There is still an allegro maestoso, which, except for its length and the fact that it contains a middle section, cantabile e religioso, we should call a long coda. The whole, evidently program music, is a sonata worked out somewhat on Kuhnau lines. Now, was Beethoven acquainted with Rust's music? Dr. Prieger, in the pamphlet mentioned above, remarks as follows: during the years 1807 to 27, Wilhelm Karl Rust, born 1787, died 1855, the youngest son of our master, was in Vienna, and had the good fortune to make the acquaintance of Beethoven, who was pleased with his playing and recommended him as teacher. Among Rust's lady pupils were Baroness Dorothea Ertmann and Maximiliana Brentano, both of whom belonged to Beethoven's most intimate circle of friends, and had been honoured by having works dedicated to them. The younger Rust was gifted with an extraordinary memory, and therefore it seemed more than probable that he occasionally performed some of his father's works in that circle. On the other hand, we have Beethoven's energetic nature holding aloof from anything which might influence his own individuality. There, in a few words, is the answer to our question, and it is about the only one we can ever hope to obtain. Rust was altogether a remarkable phenomenon, a musician born, as it were, out of due time. If Beethoven, as seems quite possible, was acquainted with his music, then Rust exerted an influence over the master quite equal to that of Clementi. It almost seems as if we ought to say greater. End of chapter 6. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire.